Welcome back to page 121. No, we're not going to take a look at Dragon 76. That's still a few months off. We are going to take a look at a column that appeared regularly in Dragon, Sage Advice. I loved Sage Advice. It was one of my favorite offerings of the old Dragons because the magazine would take various questions that have been asked about the mechanics of the AD&D game or the game universe, and then they would answer the questions. And the questions here or the answers here are actually, at the time, they were considered canon. So we could get an answer to an invisibility spell or some new character class or something we just didn't understand. Sage Advice could go ahead and help us get that straight. When I was designing or coming up with this video, I was thumbing through some of the Sage Advice columns. It was a feature for many years in Dragon. And I came across this one, and I chose this one for a reason. First off, there's no author's credit for who wrote this particular episode of Sage Advice. And that happens sometimes. They didn't always credit who did it. I always thought it was a situation where maybe a couple of people had answered questions and just submitted them, and they put it into one article of Sage Advice. I know that there were others, especially ones that got a little more thematic, where they'd have 4 or 5 questions about thieves or about invisibility. I know that those would get an author credit usually. So this one did not. But it always started out with questions kind of like this. Who was Baba Yaga, the magic user lady who made the hut artifact in the Dungeon Master's Guide? And here we get all of Baba Yaga's stats as given in Dragon Magazine number 53. And a little bit of her background. So that was kind of why it was neat. If maybe I didn't have issue 53, I think I do actually, but if I didn't, then that was at least an opportunity for me to know a little bit more about Baba Yaga. I was not familiar with the legend of Baba Yaga until I started playing D&D. And then here, can a Dungeon Master give away magical items in an adventure and then later say the items operate a reduced effectiveness or have wholly new powers? And the answer there is always, it's up to the DM. He can do whatever he wants. And then they'll give you a little gaming tip. Maybe as a DM, you don't want to do this because it might kill your campaign. Maybe you don't want to, as a player, stay in that guy's game if you can't count on being able to keep the stuff you've worked so hard for. What are mithril and adamantite? And here are 2 questions that I think were loaded in by the author. And in the old comic book days, Marvel and DC both, if they didn't get enough letters to the editor about a previous issue, or none of the letters brought up a topic that they wanted to address in the subsequent letters column, they would go ahead and just submit fake letters. They would write up a letter as if it was from, Ed Fan, and old Ed wants to know about, Superman's weakness to kryptonite or whatever. And then they would go ahead and they would give an answer from the editor. And it was always on something that they kind of wanted to address. And this became kind of a known thing in the 70s. That the comic companies were doing it. And by the 70s, they didn't really have to do it much anymore because they were getting enough fan mail that they could pick and choose real letters. But it was a thing definitely in the 60s where they would just go ahead and fake a letter. And I bring that up because I think these next 2 questions are definitely brought up by the editors. Can a player character become a free-willed vampire and be played like any other player character? Now that was a big question for a long time in AD&D. Whenever you get turned into some kind of other creature or undead, what happened to you? And the answer is no. A player character who becomes a vampire also becomes a non-player character under the Dungeon Master's control. Otherwise, the character is too powerful and the game balance starts to disappear as the PC vampire vampirizes the countryside. All undead creatures should be NPCs to emphasize the humanocentric nature of the AD&D game system. Interesting that the answer here doesn't say anything about you having free will as the DM to do whatever you want in your own campaign. It's telling you, no, you can't do that. You're not allowed to do that. I thought that was funny. That's the reason I suspect this is a question submitted by one of the editors for himself to answer. And here's the second one. In the Player's Handbook, it states that Rangers will not congregate in groups larger than 3. But in The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, this restriction does not appear. The Rangers in the AD&D game, says the answer, are not the Rangers in Tolkien's books. Granted, the 2 are related. But in the final analysis, AD&D Rangers are different. The AD&D game, more broadly, should not be interpreted too literally in the light of books and materials not developed by TSR Inc. Though individual DMs and players may do so if they wish, they should note that, for example, Tolkien's elves are immortal and AD&D elves are just long-lived. The AD&D system is not Lord of the Rings. That, I think, was put in there on advice of counsel. The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien's estate, was taking a good hard look at D&D and had launched one or two lawsuits with varying degrees of success against it for copyright infringement, because let's face it, a lot of stuff out of Lord of the Rings does appear in AD&D. Looking at you, orcs. I know orcs come from other Germanic, I believe it's Germanic mythos, but anyway. So I think this was put in so that they could actually put in print that Lord of the Rings is not AD&D and vice versa. While one may borrow from the other, it's not the same thing. And I just think it's kind of funny that they bothered to do that. And like I said, I'm sure it's on advice of their lawyers that they do it. So they had something to walk into court and say, well, here, we said right here in our own magazine that we're not Lord of the Rings. So it's kind of interesting. That's why I end up going with this issue of Sage Advice, because these two, I'm pretty sure, were letters to just get that question out so they could answer it. I'm sure that there were questions that were asked by the House staff so they could answer it in the column. I have no way to prove that, by the way. And nor do I really care to. It's just my opinion. I just know that they did that in comic books, and there's no reason at all to think they didn't do it in a column like Sage Advice. So here we have other things. Can a DM award experience points for players for solving riddles, defusing traps, setting up clever ambushes, and so forth? If so, how many points should be awarded? And it says right here, this is a problem for individual DMs to resolve. So right, and they go from here where you have to play it as written to, oh, that's up to the DM. It's funny how they vacillated between the play as written versus your own game, do what you want, especially when it came to third-party stuff like Lord of the Rings. And then this went on. This is a 2.5-page cover of various questions. And here we get a lot of stuff on the Half Ogre, which appeared a few issues earlier in Dragon Magazine. We even get a Gamma World question. What happens if Gamma World Mutant hits an AD&D character with the power of de-evolution? And it's really devastating. You don't want to play a D&D character in Gamma World. Playing a Gamma World character in D&D is a lot more survivable, although you are subject to a lot of magic. Here we have a question about the game of Knucklebones. How is this played? And it refers you to the Dungeon Master's Guide. Just another way to get you to go ahead and buy the DMG. Well, if you want the answer to that, just look in your DMG. Oh, you don't have one? Well, maybe you'll pick one up. How do you handle pregnancy in AD&D games? And then it goes on to that. Some of the characters described by Gary Gygax in your magazine have an attribute labeled CO. What is this? CO stands for comeliness, a new attribute described by Gary in issue 67 of Dragon. And yes, that is the fabled 7th stat in AD&D. And yes, we do have it. As of 85, comeliness became an official stat through Unearthed Arcana. And we had the new sheets that had the spot for the 7th stat. So we went ahead and any character that was existing at the time that didn't have a comeliness stat, we rolled a comeliness for it. I don't think it's ever come into play. It's never been anything I cared about, but it became an official 7th stat, so we rolled it. That's all I've got today on page 121. Just a quick look at a great column from the old Dragon magazines and a little bit of way they would manipulate the reader, in my opinion. But what the heck, it was business after all. That's all I've got today. I want to thank you for your time. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time on page 121.